This oral history interview is of Julius Tervay, Julius C. Tervay, T-E-R-V-A-Y.
Tervay.
We're with the 119th Engineers, 12th Armored Division. This interview is taking place on January the 12th, 1996 in Houston, Texas. He's being interviewed by Dr. Vernon L. Williams, Department of History, Abilene Christian University. What do you go by? Julius?
Jewel.
Jewel. Jewel, if you would first tell us a little bit about your family and where you grew up, and a little bit about the years before you were involved in the military.
Well, Vernon, I think that's kind of easy to handle. I came from a father who was first-generation Hungarian. My grandfather had been a colonel in the Hungarian army, and back in the late 1800s, why, he was on the wrong side and barely got out of Hungary in time to save his neck. My mother was born in Germany. She was one of 8 children. Her name was Trechak. My grandfather, her father, was the man who did the process for the green pickles for Heinz. I mean, it was the first time that you kept pickles green. And back in those days when you pickled something, why, they got pretty gray looking. And he was quite famous and well up into the Heinz Corporation when he died at 89. My father was in the hotel business. He was an ex-World War I sergeant, been on the Mexican border after Pancho Villa and then into World War I. He was with the Hoeth and Hoeth, which were accountants for hotels. So my background growing up was many schools and many times. I was in 17 schools before I ever got out of high school. You moved around the hotel business a lot. It also was an education from my growing up standpoint that I got to learn to do a lot of cooking and cleaning up and doing things in hotel restaurants. Serves me well today. Basically, my high school was in Hackensack, New Jersey, one of the few places we stayed long enough for me to go to school 4 years. And I was an all-state end for Hackensack in football. I played basketball, but wasn't that good in basketball as I was in football. I had a scholarship to Duquesne University, and in 1938, that was worth a lot of money to us because that's about the only way we would ever get to college. I have one sister, and right now I'm the last of my family. What else do you need to know on this? I covered it pretty much on that. We'd like a little business history, but that comes after World War II.
Yeah, we'll cover that towards the end. Tell us a little bit of how you sort of transitioned from high school to the CCC.
Well, during the summers, when I started in the sophomore year in high school, what's that going to be, 34, 35, somewhere in that area, the CCCs were first formed because I was part of the WPA and all the rest of those great letters that President Roosevelt had come up with, but it was a great way to get youth off the street. We couldn't find jobs or anything. So in my sophomore year, I went into the CCCs and for the summer. And that was my sophomore, junior, and senior year in high school. I spent the summers in the CCCs. I was up in Quoddy, Maine, building fire trails, doing whatever it did. I think today when I look at all the national parks, I think we wouldn't have any of them if it hadn't been for the CCCs because they've built just about all the fire breaks and all the national parks that we have. It was excellent training. And it was a way to make some money. We didn't make a whole lot of money. We made $12 a month. But that was a lot of money in those days.
What was the living conditions like?
Well, it was during the Depression. I grew up during the Depression. I can't ever remember not working. I used to have a job in a nursery, and I'm talking about a gardening nursery, that I had to be there at 5:30 in the morning, and we dug up all the trees and did everything out of there that we getting loaded to go out. And then I went to school, came back after school and started at about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we went out and planted everything. And for that, I got $7 for that whole week. And that was, sometimes was the whole $7 was all the family had. We weren't destitute, I don't mean that. My father worked enough during the Depression that I can't say that at any time we were poor. Yeah, we were down on the milk line with the 2-gallon pail of milk to get your milk for 2 cents a gallon and all those kind of things. I mean, because that was part of life in those days. But nobody that I know of in my family ever went on welfare or did anything like that. I mean, I'm 73 years old now, and I've never been on unemployment in my life. And I don't think it came in our age group that you did those kind of things. I mean, it was a disgrace to be on welfare or to take handouts. You took care of your own. I can't, as I say, I can't complain at all. I mean, it's probably didn't know any better. Somebody once asked me, were you ever young? And I said, I can't ever remember being young because I never had a chance to be young. I mean, between the Depression days and working and doing whatever you had to do to help the family, why, then World War II came along, and the heck, by the time you were 22, 23 years old, you were an old man. So having youthful things just doesn't seem to fit in that. That's my only outlet was high school sports. Fortunately, in those days, I was big enough and good enough to be recognized. It might be of interest to know that for my high school team, there were 4 of those boys went on to be All-Americans in college, and 2 of them played professional football. So Augie Leo, by the way, was an All-American at Georgetown. He was killed in Europe during World War II. Jimmy Blumenstock was an All-American at Fordham, played on that great Fordham team of those years, and went on to play with the New York Giants. And Pat Paderewski played ball and played, I believe, I can't remember entirely, but I think with the Chicago Bears for a couple of years. So it was an interesting football team from that era to have that many go on to college and play professional football. I played 1 year professional football after World War II, and I found out very quickly that those kids were a lot younger than I was, and when you start wearing your belly button on your spine, well, not only that, you don't have the desire to do it anymore. But I thought the interesting comment I would like to make at this point, I got $3,780 salary that year. I know I was only third string, but you didn't get paid anything when you were in town. I played for the New York Giants. You didn't get any money when you were in town. And then they took care of your hotel and the meals when you were on the road. But when I see these guys signing a contract for $20 million, I kind of shake a little bit and wonder why.
Well, did any of the your teammates go into the CCC with you?
No. I mean, I had other fellows from high school that went in, but none of them were on the team and or played sports. A lot of them were in the CCCs. A couple of them quit high school and stayed in the CCCs, made it a full-time thing because they were learning a trade. And we were going through the era then of where, if you remember, you were allowed to tell children in the 6th grade that they were smart enough to go on to college preparatory courses or they had to take a trade school. Today, I don't think they could get away with something like that, but that was one of the things that happened. Most of the boys who went into the CCCs that I can remember and still had a little bit of contact with, I lost a lot of contact with them during the war, and then after the war, well, it was pretty hard to find any of them. Stayed in the regular army. Because most of us from the CCCs went into the National Guard. I went into the National Guard my senior year in high school, 29th Infantry Division from New Jersey. And it was another way of getting a little bit of income for the house. I mean, that's basically what you were looking at. I mean, it was a job that you didn't have to work every day at and still got some pay at the end of the month. I got to Duquesne for a semester and a half before the 29th Infantry Division was called in for active duty for that 1 year. And I never finished up my college degrees until quite a few years after the war. Now that's got us up to going into service. Where do you want to go from there?
Well, what did you do during that year of active duty with the 29th?
Well, we were down on, first thing we did, and this is, I know you see and have seen people saying that the soldiers were walking around with broomsticks and make-believe guns and everything else. This was not unusual. We were all like that. I mean, we just didn't have it. I mean, we had 2 rifles in our whole company. Everybody else had broomsticks, so when you went out on the rifle range to fire, well, everybody had to use those 2 guns. Trucks were almost non-existent, I mean, from the standpoint of what we consider today how they move infantry. Infantry then moved on its feet. I mean, that was... And most of our training was down in Louisiana, out of Camp Polk to doing infantry training, and about halfway through my first year, I mean, that first year we were in, why, I got called into the commanding officer's office for him to ask me whether or not my history was right, that I did drive a truck and I had driven a tractor and I did know how to use saws and this and that and a few other things, and I'd been in the CCCs, and I said yes. And he said, well, they're forming the 1st Armored Division at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and they're looking for people with your kind of background to go into the Armored Division. Have you got any objection to that? Well, I had no objection. It was anything was better than slugging along on your feet. It seemed like at that time was a good idea. So I ended up at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where they were forming the 1st Armored Division. And because of all the training I'd had with the CCCs and whatnot, I ended up in the 1st Armored Engineer Battalion. And you can well imagine when tanks came in and things of this nature came down to Fort Knox, it was a learning curve for all of us. Nobody had ever seen them before. The officers were in worse shape, most of them, than we were. At least some of us had been able to drive tractors and whatnot, so we weren't confused about clutching and doing other things when we got into this equipment. And we had very few of the officers who knew anything about a bulldozer or building any kind of bridge work out of wood or whatever you, let's put it this way, scrounging material to build things. So our officers were in a learning curve as well as the enlisted personnel. At this time I was a buck sergeant and a platoon leader. We didn't have the ranks that kept coming along later on. I mean, corporal was a pretty good rate in those days for an enlisted man. You had one 1st sergeant, and he was the 1st sergeant over the whole battalion. And you had company sergeants who may be anything from a buck sergeant to, at that time they had just brought in the staff sergeant rank. And he may have had that. And we went on maneuvers down again in Louisiana, learned what we could do and what we couldn't do. We had only the light tanks. We had very light equipment. Most of our trucks were not 4-wheel drive trucks, so we were getting jammed and stuck a lot. The equipment was typically what had been on the highways and was converted to a military vehicle when they started doing this. Nobody had really designed any real military equipment. And then, of course, when the war broke out on December 7th, we had that, and then we made the 1st Armored Division was part of the group that went over to North Africa and made the invasion of North Africa. And I was with the 1st Armored Division for almost 7 months before I got wounded and came back to the United States on R&D.
When was this?
You know, I can't even remember the date, Vern. I'm trying to think of it, but I can't remember it. I'd have to look it up. I'm not one of these guys that's great on...
Do you remember about what part of the year?
Last part of 42, somewhere in there. I know it was cold when I got back, so it had to be...
What was the nature of your wound?
I was shot in this right knee, and I have a plate in it now. Lost a kneecap, and I zigged when I should have zagged.
Well, tell us about the circumstances.
Well, we had been catching an awful lot of flack from the Germans because our tanks were all these light tanks with 37 millimeters. The Germans had put a lot of minefields out, and as engineers, why, we were out there trying in the sand with your bayonets clearing minefields to get your tanks through so that they could get out and do some reconnaissance and find out where the German main lines were. But in the meantime, when we did have contact with them, we were in real trouble because our 37 millimeter shells bounced off those German tanks like you were throwing a rubber ball against them. And we just were so outmanned firepower, it wasn't funny. The 1st Armored Division had 3 times replacements in the first 5 months. When we say that, that's when you're more than 50% casualties. You go into replacements. Most of the time as engineers, we were, if you want to call it, we were high-priced infantrymen. We were out in front doing whatever we had to do. And that's the way the engineers were the whole time. I mean, as far as armored engineers were concerned. We never had heavy weaponry, so we were always at the mercy of whoever we were supporting to protect us. I don't know whether anybody from the 12th beside myself had been over there. I think there were a few that were in the 1st Armored that I know of. But if you've never been in desert combat, this is really something. I know you'd be up there at 125, 130 degrees during the daytime, be down to 35, 40 degrees at nighttime. The temperature changes were tremendous in the desert. Most of our equipment wasn't designed for dust and things like that. We had to, oh gosh, we'd jury-rig things to keep the carburetors clean, to keep the dust from coming into the gearboxes. And
was it you that was telling me in St. Louis or Hot Springs about the filter that they tried to send out?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, when they sent a filter out to us to put into the tanks in that way, it was somebody had designed the thing in Detroit or somewhere and never saw any dust. And what we had basically done then, we couldn't use the filter because it clogged up immediately. It was worse than not having the filter on. I mean, basically all you did was make a catch for the dust with this new filter that they came out. So we redesigned the filter type of equipment by using cheesecloth and whatnot, made our own filter. And that's what we went through the war with. I mean, as far up until I left, before they finally got some decent equipment. But the people had no idea of what we were talking about in dust. You know, it's one thing running one vehicle over a dusty field. It's another thing putting that vehicle in the middle of 30 other in the desert. I mean, that's going to create a whole lot of different conditions. And unfortunately, most R&D people are lab people. And that's what you get, that type of equipment. We finally started to get decent equipment after we'd also captured enough German equipment and was able to send parts and things back so that we could copy them. Because they were way far advanced over us on desert warfare and equipment, tracks. I mean, basically, when we were over there, it was, I would put it this way, it was like a good college team fighting a damn good pro team. any sport you wanted to put in the beginning of that.
What about morale?
Most of us, as far as morale is concerned, that's a hard word to put up. If you're talking about morale from the standpoint of were we discouraged, were we this, no, because you're afraid for your life, you're doing the best you can to stay alive, you're doing the best you can to keep your buddies alive. Morale was not bad. What was bad was the fact that we knew we were outmanned, we knew we were outmaneuvered, we knew we were out equipment. And this is hard when you fight that. Yeah, you get down. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, buts about it. But the surprising thing is it creates great ingenuity. You learn how to take your piece of equipment, which isn't as good, and how to make it much better by how you position it, how you use it, what you do with it. We learned to use hand grenades, fighting tanks, which nobody would have even thought that you would be doing. But you learn how to do that. You learn how to dig yourself a trench and let them run over you, and then stand up behind them and drop the grenade down their turret. And that also took a little bit of different fortitude. It's one thing worrying about getting hit with a bullet. It's another thing worried about that track being 3 inches away from where you thought it was going to be.
You were mentioning the circumstances of your wound, that taking place. Just how did that happen? Was that out in a minefield?
Well, after we'd cleared a minefield, then we had to go on up this point. And while we were going up for point, I caught a fragment from the shell that had exploded, a mortar shell, and that's what happened, because they had us zeroed in then on that. They knew where we were coming. I mean, because hell, they had all the time while we were cleaning the minefields to get themselves zeroed in and pick the position they were going to fire at when we got to it. And the desert's like anything else. I mean, you can call it you got sand dunes, you have this and that. I mean, you've got to go through them, so it's like going between two cliffs. And they know you're coming. That's the only way you're going to come, because you can't get up over the top of that dune, so you're going to have to go through them. So they had a good opportunity to have everything lined up for their gunners and have all their azimuth marks and everything lined up so that when you got there, what you tried to do in those things, knowing full well it was going to happen to you, you tried to throw them off by the amount of troops you put through at one time, or how you went through, or what you did, or whether you put armor through it first, or you put walking troops through it first. In most cases, we put walking troops through it first, hoping that we could get close enough to the mortars and their artillery to be able to do something before they got to our heavy equipment. I think, so as far as I'm concerned, the officers that we had in those days were cavalry officers. They were in no better shape than any of the enlisted men on how the hell to handle the equipment and what the heck to do and how to fight the battle.
What happened as soon as you were hit? You remember anything, or were you out?
No, I was not out. I mean, one of the guys came up and put a tourniquet on my leg. Medics were about an hour and a half behind, and I was fortunate in catching one of the trucks came along, one of the supply trucks came along and picked me up and put me in the back of the supply truck, so I rode in the truck instead of laying in the sand, and we stayed with the battle lines all the way up there until the medics caught up to us, and then I got sent back to field hospital. And about all they did back at the field hospital is take one look at it, take bone chips out and a few other things out of it, and then sent me back to the field hospital on back for major surgery. And at that time, they decided I needed a plate, and they couldn't do it over there. And that's when I came back home.
Where did you come to?
I came to Fort Knox and was at the hospital at Fort Knox. And I was there for 6 months, and at the end of the 6 months, I was reassigned as cadre to the 12th Armored Division at Camp Campbell, Kentucky at that time. And I guess I got down there in December 42, something like that.
Who were some of the officers that you served under there in that early time?
Well, in the early times, we had Lieutenant Moon, who eventually became a major. And I'm going to be honest with you, Vern, I don't remember a lot of the other officers. Moon was one of the few that stayed. The rest of them were in and out and in and out. We had a whole flock of new officers coming in during the cadre period of time. Most of the non-coms were running the company, running the battalions. We had to build a camp. I mean, it wasn't just a question of having new troops come in. It was a question of having to build a whole new camp as well, streets and the whole schmear. So it was an interesting time. I mean, from meeting a lot of them, I can remember in the beginning we got a lot of the men who were in their 40s, draftees, and they just couldn't cut the mustard. I mean, it was just impossible, and finally they were discharged out of it. A lot of nice guys. We also had a couple World War I sergeants that were still there. Sergeant Kill was one that I remember, and that's his name, Kill. And I think at that particular time he'd had something like 21, 22 years in, and he went overseas with the 12th and was killed overseas. And
You remember what battalion he was with?
he was with the 119th. In fact, I think he was the 2nd Platoon sergeant at the time. That's when Chiquetti took over, and Chiquetti was later killed at Herlesheim. And I'm not very good at a lot of this, Vern. I mean, I guess it's like too many things have happened over the years that I can't remember minute details back there. I mean, World War II was not my only war, nor was it the only thing I've done. And so I'm not up on dates, times, places as well as some of the other people are.
Let me ask you a question about Carlos Brewer. What do you think of him as a commanding general?
Well, Carlos Brewer, as far as I know, from field applications that we had with him, was a typical major that got promoted because of a war. He really had no command experience, but what officer did in those days? I mean, I thought Brewer was a good training officer. I thought he was a good administrator. I don't think he was a good field commander. I don't think he had any more idea of what to do. I mean, the few times that I met him was when he called in people that, like myself, who had been over in North Africa and was trying to get some idea of how a war, I didn't change it too much for you, did I? How much a war changes from what the book said. I mean, and one of his hardest things to understand was that you had to take the tactics book and throw it away. First of all, there was no tactics book that had ever been written for armor. Tactics books were all cavalry, and they were as useless as you know what. And the tactics books that were coming out from what had happened in North Africa. I mean, basically, and things of this nature. Carlos Brewer, as I said, was a good administrative officer as far as I know, but as far as a leader in combat, I'm glad he didn't go. I mean, I don't think he would have been able to do it.
Are you aware of the circumstances surrounding his relief at Barclay?
I've heard different stories. I'm not up to what really caused it. I mean, it had to be something good.
Well,
I think basically what happened at Barclay was that he'd screwed up on maneuvers, and it was obvious that he was not capable of handling a combat command.
There's some confusion about what actually happened in terms of his rank. Was he actually reduced to full colonel and later went back to 2-star, or are you aware of what happened?
He was reduced to a full colonel at that hearing. And he had a formal hearing.
Where did that take place?
I'm not sure, but it was not at Barclay, all right? And when the news then he never came back to the division after that. But we were told he'd been reduced to full colonel. And then I think, like all officers at the time, he probably got his rank back because he was a good administrative officer, so he probably got into some administrative jobs that got it back. And as far as being a major general, I don't think he ever got anything back but 1 star. But as you know, when you retire, you always get 1 grade upgrade, so that's probably where he got his 2 stars on his retirement.
Well, you're now with the 12th Armored Division at Camp Campbell. This is before they moved to Barclay, Texas. You tell me a little bit about the training that you were actually doing, maybe the Tennessee maneuvers as well, at Camp Campbell.
I think, naturally, your regular day training is your regular day training, all right? You've probably had enough on that. Maneuvers are the things that will be of interest, and the Tennessee maneuvers were always interesting to me because I think it was the first time that any engineers had ever built Tervay Bridge up the river and floated it down into place. I noticed reading about them just doing this over in Czechoslovakia, floating a bridge down into place. I mean, that was done way back in Tennessee in those days. We were like everybody else. We had new equipment then. We had guns. We had things. We had some very good officers. And we had men that were very interesting. We had a lot of non-coms that were really the backbone. Not non-coms are the backbone of any organization, but we had some very good non-coms. The Tennessee maneuvers gave most of the men their first experience in being in the field, not going back to showers, barracks, things of this nature. It gave us a chance to show them different things that you had to do that was not in the book. I mean, we didn't have dump trucks as an example, all right? So what we had to do is show these guys how we could dig a little hole. So they back up to it and just start down and slam on the brakes and dump your load out of a fixed unit. I mean, you don't have a dump truck, you got to find another way to get it out besides pick and shovel. And we had learning, teach everybody how to drive a bulldozer, how to do this. Everybody had to be trained as far as the engineers were concerned in doing more than one job because you didn't know what was going to happen to somebody. You might be driving a truck, you might be driving a bulldozer, you might be building a bridge, you might be a machine gunner. And this is all part of it. They said the engineers, as far as I'm concerned, I've always called them a very highly specialized infantryman because basically most engineers are fine infantrymen and have been. But it was a day-to-day type of thing. For me, it was a snap because I'd gone through it before, and I had no particular problems with maneuvers. Some of the problems we had then were, of course, they were trying to look for new officers, so they were going through your IQ business and this and that, and a lot of our men were left and went to OCS out of there, as well as out of Barclay. In fact, out of Barclay, we had a lot of men called back from Fort Belvoir with only about 20 days to go to get their commission when 12th Armored Division got orders to ship out of Barclay to go overseas, and the general called us to call everybody back out of OCS, which didn't set well.
So they came back in their enlisted ranks.
Yes. Which I don't think was fair of him. I mean, he knew damn well the division wasn't going overseas that fast. We were going to be up at Shanks. We were going to be there for a good while, which we were for months. Everybody could have finished, got their commissions, either come back to the division or gone to other divisions. So I thought he played a pretty nasty little game of politics.
These men that were going into OCS, though, had been at least partially trained. What impact did this have, sort of draining them away? Who'd you replace them with?
Well, you always remember that if most of the guys that went to OCS were squad leaders or platoon leaders, either a buck sergeant or a staff sergeant, and he had a corporal or he had a sergeant underneath him who was, in my case, just as good as he was. I mean, there was only 3 or 4 of us that I know of in the 12th Armored Division that had any experience with combat. And that didn't do us any, as far as I was concerned, it didn't do much, because I stayed in my rank as sergeant till we went overseas, and a long time after we were overseas. I wasn't particularly looking for a rank of going to OCS. In fact, I turned down going to OCS. I didn't really want to be an officer. No particular reason, just like what I was doing.
What do you remember about Barclay as a base? Could you describe the 119th area? In other words, what'd you live in, and
you know, I can't even remember the area we lived in, but you know, we had all those big huts out there. I mean, they were 12-man barracks and that, and I think I'm typical of most people. I like to remember the amusing things, the fun things, rather than the bad things. I remember the weather in Barclay. I mean, you know, let's face it, I mean, if you stood still long enough, you had sunshine, snow, wind, everything else blowing past. I remember some of those 30-mile hikes up through the mountains up there. It was pretty rough, I mean, because of the weather and whatnot. Abilene is not noted for its best weather. And Abilene itself wasn't much of a town in those days. And it was nice to go back a couple of years ago for the marker festivities to see what had happened to it and how it had grown. But I guess what you're looking for, most soldiers every day, I mean, it was the same duty roster, the same thing that you had to do. I mean, you had your training, you had your motor pools, you had this, you had that, you had your leaves. It wasn't really anything complicated. I mean, as far as Barclay wasn't as complicated really as Campbell. I mean, Barclay was an easier snap. The troops were much better trained. You know what I'm talking about. There was a whole lot less headaches that you had to do.
Did you engineers use Fort Phantom Lake or Abilene to do any additional bridging?
We did very little bridge building in Abilene. Most of our work in Abilene was with mines, detonating, deactivating bombs. We lost 4 men in Abilene, and I don't know who made the mistake, but somebody made the mistake, and we were de-arming a bomb, and somebody made a mistake. We lost four of our men there. That's part of that game. But most of our work, as far as engineers were concerned at Barclay, was really that. I mean, showing how to break up roadblocks, clear minefields. We knew we were going to get an awful lot of that. And we knew we were going to get a lot of bombs. We knew we were going to have a lot of bombs strung on the bridges, under this, that had to be deactivated. And so that was what most of our training was in Barclay. I mean, as far as the engineers were concerned. We really didn't even have any maneuvers down in Barclay.
Well, tell us a little bit about the trip out of Barclay on your way to Camp Shanks and the trip over to England.
Well, it was a hell of a long train ride. Miserable. I think the things you remember were, along the line, the women that were standing out there to give coffee and sandwiches at some of these railroad stations at 3 o'clock in the morning. I mean, those are the things that made you feel good. I don't know whether that's what you're looking for, but that's the kind of things I remember, because I could see my mother doing it. And I was watching a lot of other fellows' mothers out there doing it. It didn't make any difference what time our train came through. There was somebody there. when we got to Shanks, of course, we got to Shanks when cold winter, and I think we hit one of the worst tornadoes or hurricanes in New York had ever had at that particular time. And but the period of time at Shanks was just a plain waiting period, and trying to keep physically competent, but there wasn't really a whole lot of things that happened at Shanks.
Did you get any passes?
I got a couple passes, but what the heck was a pass? You didn't have any money. You know, it's not much fun to ride a train for an hour into New York, an hour and a half into New York, and have $1 in your pocket, so you might just as well stay in the camp and go to the movie. But then the group went over ahead of time, of course, to England to set up at Newburgh, and where we were going into England to be barracks, Tidworth Barracks and that area. I was not part of that group. So I can't even remember the name of the ship I went over on. But remember getting to England, can remember the truck ride out to Tidworth Barracks and spending time at Tidworth. One of the basic things I remember most about Tidworth was that when we were getting ready to go over into France, why, England had been the biggest rip-off place of anywhere in the world as far as soldiers losing equipment and ripping other outfits off for equipment, because when you left you had to leave fully with all the gear that you came over with, and a lot of that gear had disappeared one way or another. And I remember going out with some parties while we were getting tarps and other things off of other units' trucks. I mean, should we say relocating it, and guns and other things that needed to, before we went over to France.
What was accommodations like there in Tidworth? Do you remember anything about that?
They weren't bad. I mean, in one sense, they were a hell of a lot better than Barclay. I mean, from one end, we had plenty of time off. I mean, if you're looking at it from that standpoint, I mean, it was interesting to go around the English countryside. I mean, I and a couple of the other guys were fortunate enough to be able to get bicycles, so we were able to bicycle around and do things and get to see some of the places. I never went into London, never had any desire to go into London. But I enjoyed Tidworth from the standpoint that it was a nice stopover. I mean, and basically it was cold, I mean, but so was Barclay. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, depending on what happened, but the accommodations weren't bad, the food wasn't bad, nothing was. I had it a hell of a lot worse a long time before that, North Africa, so anything after that was kind of easy.
Well, tell us about... Okay, let's pick up. You're shipping over across the channel to France. What do you remember about that?
Gosh, Vern, I wish you hadn't said that, because I really don't remember anything except being crowded like hell on Dick. I think probably the scariest in my life was going over the side of the ship on a rope ladder. When we got over there, going down into the landing barges. I've always been a good swimmer, but that's a totally different complex with having your full field pack on and a rifle and everything else, and climbing down a rope ladder off the side of a ship into a landing barge that's bouncing like a rubber ball on the water. I think that's what I remember the most about that particular invasion. And later in my life I had a few others, but it wasn't in World War II. I really don't remember a whole lot about getting there. I mean, we mounted up. I think some of the things that you have to remember, the 119th Engineers never fought as 119th Engineers. Each company of the engineers was assigned to one of the combat commands, Combat Command A, B, or what was it, R, I think, was the other one. And one company was held in reserve all the time. So as engineers, we never fought as a battalion. We were always assigned elsewhere. Then once we got into the Combat Command Reserve, well, then we were split up more. I mean, from being just a company, we were split up into being a platoon with recon, a platoon with this, a platoon with that. So as a whole, we very seldom ever fought as a unit. Herrlisheim was the only place that I can remember us fighting as a unit. And like everybody else, Herrlisheim was our first real baptism into combat. Wintertime, cold, miserable. And we were building a bridge, which wasn't uncommon. I mean, it was our first real bridge under combat fire, and the Germans were very nice. I mean, they let us build the bridge, they let us get some of our equipment across, and then they blew the bridge. And getting out of that area, we had to go through a pass. It wasn't very far behind us. And the Germans' 88 marksmanship was very, very excellent, because I think I do have to put in a little bit of comedy into what was a very tragic situation. Command half-track we sent out first, and it got through. The second was a 6x4 supply truck, and the 88s got it, and the third vehicle got through, and the fourth vehicle was a supply truck, and I can't remember who the kid was, but he was from North Carolina, and he said, "Sergeant, the only thing I know," he said, "I ain't very damn smart," he said, "but I can count and I ain't going." And out of a hell of a miserable battle, that's one of the funniest things that you can remember about it. There's other people, Vern, that can tell you more about battles and fights and things of this nature than I can. I've appreciated this opportunity, and I thank you very much.
You don't want to talk a little bit about what happened to you after the war?
Well, I'd be happy to tell you that. I mean, from that standpoint, I was...
One thing...
Well, one thing is I got a battlefield commission right at the end of the war, all right?
That's what I wanted to find out about.
And...
Tell us how you found out about that commission and what happened.
Well, one of the things about that was that the war was just about over. We were down at Hitler's area, down that way, and I'd lost all my officers out of the company. I mean, they're out of the platoon, battalion and whatnot. And that wasn't uncommon, but usually we had replacement officers fairly fast. Well, I got a second lieutenant one day and came in and reported in, and I said, "Well, sir, I guess you're the new company commander." And he said, "No, I'm not, Sergeant." And he said, "What assignment do I have?" I said, "Well," I said, "we've got 4 platoons, and we don't have an officer in either one of them, so you got to pick." I got a first lieutenant the next day. The same thing happened, so I thought it was time for me to go back to headquarters and find out what was going on. So got in the Jeep and went on back and reported in, and said, "I'd like to see the old man if I can." I said, "I got some problems up there." And there was a new captain who was back there as adjutant, and I really didn't know him. And he said, "Well, Sergeant, he's been waiting for you. He wondered why it took you this long to get here." So I went in and saluted, and I said, "Colonel," I said, "I've got a problem." He said, "What's your problem?" He didn't say any rank, which surprised me, because he always used rank. I mean, he was very rank conscious when you talked to him. I said, "Well, sir," I said, "I've had 2 officers report in the last 2 days. Neither one of them is to take over the company, and it's very embarrassing as a sergeant to be running a company with 2 officers underneath him." He said, "Well, who the hell says you're a sergeant?" I said, "I do, sir. I'm looking at him." He says, No. He says, "You made a mistake, Tervay." He says, "You didn't read everything you signed." He says, "And one day," he says, "we slipped in your discharge as an enlisted man, and the next day we slipped in your commission as an officer." He said, "You signed them both." He says, "And you now are a first lieutenant, and you are still the company commander." You are excused. That was my indoctrination to getting screwed into being an officer.
Do you want to tell the story about
Well,
the mess line?
I think I have to tell the story about the mess line because that was funny, because I'd been with these guys now ever since we'd landed in France, and had a lot of them, but people that don't change are your mess crew pretty much. They're much there all the time, and when I got back, why, it was chow time. Everybody was eating lunch, and so I didn't think anything of it. I got out of the Jeep, grabbed my mess kit, walked over, got in line, worked up to the chow, and Sergeant looked up at me and said, "Fucking officers eat last." And that was my initiation to being an officer back in the company I'd been with since it was founded.
Well, what happened after this?
After that, I was assigned. I was only there 3 more days, and I was transferred back to the 119th Combat Command Engineers. Now, that sounds silly to have both 119th Armored Engineers, 119th Combat Engineers, but they do exist. And this organization's job was to clear Cherbourg Harbor of all the sunken ships. And since I'd had a lot of training with demolition, I guess my thumbtack was in my name, and I got this beautiful assignment. So at that particular time, I think I had 129 points, and they were sending people back with something like 60. And I was trying to get out, and the colonel took one look at me and he said, "You're essential. Just don't talk to me anymore. That's it. You're here." So I was there for an extra 6 months, helping to, we'd go down, blow the ships, then bring them up by pieces, and clear the harbor that way. So that was my initiation to becoming an officer, which ended up costing me probably another 7 months overseas. When I came home, they tried to get me to stay in, and I said, "No, I'm not going to stay in." I was in the National Guard once before, and that 1 year has now ended up as 5.5. One out. Well, you can't get out. You can go into reserve, but inactive reserve or active reserve. I said, "I don't want any active reserve." And during the period of time, I know I'm talking longer than I said I would, but during this period of time, I met my wife, who was a widow of a Navy lieutenant commander that was killed. He was a pilot. And we were married. He's got a house going, got all this beautiful stuff going. Mortgage is up to the hilt. My first house was $4,990. That was a lot of money. 6 rooms of furniture, and I had a 18-month-old son. And everybody on the block went back into the National Guard, to reactivated everything to get, at that time now you're paying $80, $90 a month. That was a lot of money. Because I was making $180 a month selling restaurant blend coffee, going to Duquesne at night school. And make a long story short, about 2.5 years later, when I got a call one morning about 6 o'clock in the morning, my wife was on the phone, which surprised the hell out of me because I was down there loading my coffee truck up to go. And she says, "Captain Tervay?" I said, "What the hell is this all about?" And she said, "Well, that's what this telegram says." And I said, "What else does that telegram say?" She said, "I don't want to open it." I said, "Well, you better." And she says, "Well, it says Captain Tervay report to Fort Ord, California in 76 hours. I said, "You're kidding." And she says, "No." I don't know about the rest of you people, but if you ever got power of attorney and tried to change all of your affairs and do everything and still get to California in 76 hours, it ain't easy. And I got 2.5 more years in Korea, so, and a couple more Purple Hearts. So I ended up with 5 Purple Hearts, and I think that's enough. And I think that's enough for the interview.
Thank you very much. This is the end of the interview.